If you hear someone calling for help in freezing water, you do not hesitate. That was the only thought in Jack Miller's mind as he stood on the edge of a narrow river cutting through the early morning forest. The white-skinned veteran had been traveling alone with his German shepherd when the sound broke the silence, sharp and desperate, like it did not belong to the world around him. Within seconds, he saw her, barely visible beneath the dark current, struggling against the freezing flow that pulled everything downward. Without waiting for logic or fear to catch up, Jack ran forward and dove into the river. The cold hit like a shock through every part of his body, but he kept moving, fighting the water, reaching through the pressure until his hands finally found her arm. Step by step, he pulled her toward the surface, pushing through the current until both of them broke free onto the muddy riverbank. The woman lay still for a moment, breathing unevenly, her clothes soaked and her face pale from exhaustion. Jack knelt beside her, checking her breathing, while his German shepherd stood a few feet away, unusually tense, staring at a small metal case tied tightly to the woman's bag. The dog did not move closer. It only watched, low growl building in its chest, as if it sensed something wrong beneath the surface. The woman slowly opened her eyes but did not speak at first. Instead, she looked at Jack with an expression that was not relief, but something closer to fear. Then she whispered softly, "You were not supposed to find me." The word stayed in the air longer than expected, carried by the wind through the trees. Jack did not respond immediately. He simply observed her condition, noticing details that did not fit a normal drowning victim, her controlled breathing, her alertness returning too quickly, the way her gaze kept shifting toward the metal case as if it mattered more than her survival. When he offered help to stand, she hesitated, then finally allowed him to guide her. The German shepherd followed closely, still focused on the case, unwilling to relax. They moved slowly away from the river, into the deeper forest path leading toward Jack's isolated cabin. The silence between them was heavy, not peaceful. It felt like something had already begun, something neither of them had named yet. And as the trees closed in behind them, Jack could not shake the feeling that pulling her out of the river was not the end of something, but the beginning of something far larger waiting to unfold. The forest path toward Jack Miller's isolated cabin stretched longer than it should have, as if the distance itself had changed after they left the river. The white-skinned veteran moved at a steady pace, guiding the woman carefully while his German shepherd stayed unusually close, never once breaking focus from the small metal case still tied to her soaked bag. The woman, still weak from the freezing water, did not resist, but she also did not speak again. Her silence felt intentional, like every word she withheld carried weight she was not ready to share. Jack noticed how quickly her breathing had stabilized, far faster than expected for someone who had nearly drowned in a river only minutes before. There was something unusual in her recovery, not alarming in a physical sense, but inconsistent enough to raise quiet questions in his mind. When they finally reached the cabin, the wooden structure stood alone in a clearing surrounded by tall trees and dry wind. Jack opened the door and guided her inside, placing her near the small fire stove to warm up. The woman sat without hesitation, her eyes scanning the interior as if evaluating every detail rather than seeking comfort. The German shepherd remained at the entrance, watching her closely, still fixated on the metal case she had refused to let go of even during the walk. Jack poured water into a cup and placed it near her hands. She accepted it but did not drink immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment before speaking in a softer voice. "You should not have brought me here," she said. Jack responded calmly, "You were not in a condition to stay in the river." Her gaze shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in concern that seemed deeper than the situation itself. As the fire began to warm the room, Jack noticed something else that felt out of place. The woman's hands were steady now, too steady for someone who had just survived cold shock exposure. Her movements were controlled, deliberate, almost as if she had regained strength through something other than time. The German shepherd suddenly stepped forward one pace, then stopped, its attention locked on the metal case again. A low, controlled alertness filled its posture, not aggression, but recognition. Jack followed its gaze. The case was small, dark, and sealed tightly with reinforced edges. It looked ordinary at first glance, but its presence in the room felt disproportionate, as if it carried significance beyond its size. "What is inside that?" Jack asked finally. The woman hesitated. For the first time since the river, her confidence cracked slightly. "It is not something I can explain easily," she said. Jack studied her carefully. "Try," he replied. She looked down at the case, then back at him. "It is not just mine," she said quietly. "And it was never supposed to be opened where it is now." The words hung in the air, adding weight to the already quiet cabin. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden walls, and for a brief moment, even the German shepherd stopped moving completely, as if listening for something beyond hearing range. Jack slowly leaned back, absorbing her answer without interrupting. The situation was no longer just about rescue or survival. Something had followed her out of the river, something that had already been in motion long before he ever heard her call for help. And inside the cabin, with a sealed case, a recovering stranger, and a silent dog refusing to relax, Jack began to understand that whatever he had pulled from the water was not an ending point, but a connection point to something still waiting to reveal itself. The night had already begun to settle over the small riverside town when the veteran realized that nothing about that rescue had been ordinary. The water was calm now, almost too calm, as if it had erased every trace of the struggle that had taken place just hours earlier. His name was Daniel Mercer, a white American veteran in his early 40s, weathered by years of service and silence. He stood near the riverbank, where he had pulled the woman to safety, his boots still damp, his breathing slower now but his mind refusing to settle. The woman he had saved was named Evelyn Carter, also white, dressed in a soaked coat that clung to her as she sat under a blanket provided by a passing ranger. She should have been relieved, yet there was something distant in her eyes, something guarded that did not match the relief of survival. Daniel noticed it immediately, the same way he used to notice shifts in terrain before anything appeared on a map. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice soft but steady, thanking him in a way that felt rehearsed rather than emotional. Daniel nodded, but his attention drifted to the strange object that had fallen from her pocket during the rescue, a small metallic key attached to a worn leather tag with no visible markings. He had not mentioned it yet, but he had seen the ranger pick it up and place it in a sealed evidence pouch for safekeeping. When Daniel asked what it was, Evelyn hesitated for a moment longer than comfort allowed. She said it was nothing important, just an old personal item she had forgotten about, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the blanket as she spoke. That small reaction told Daniel more than her words did. The ranger nearby explained that Evelyn had been found upstream near an old restricted section of the river, a place locals avoided due to unstable ground and abandoned infrastructure from decades ago. Daniel listened carefully, his instincts sharpening. He had spent enough years in unfamiliar terrain to recognize when something had been left behind on purpose rather than by accident. Evelyn insisted she had simply lost her footing while walking alone, but the direction she had come from did not match any accessible trail. As the conversation slowed, Daniel noticed a faint mark on her wrist, a thin line shaped like an old bracelet indentation, suggesting she had been holding something tightly for a long time before the fall. The ranger mentioned that the item tag on the key referenced no registered property in the county database, which only deepened the mystery. Evelyn finally stood, refusing medical transport, insisting she was fine and needed to leave soon. Daniel offered to walk her back to town, and after a brief hesitation, she accepted. The path along the river was quiet, broken only by the sound of distant water and the crunch of gravel underfoot. As they walked, Evelyn's composure slowly shifted, revealing small cracks in her controlled exterior. She asked Daniel if he believed people ended up in places by chance or by something more deliberate. The question lingered in the air longer than expected, and Daniel replied that in his experience, nothing important ever happened by accident. At that moment, Evelyn stopped walking for a brief second, looking toward the dark line of trees along the riverbank as if she expected something or someone to appear. Daniel followed her gaze but saw nothing except shadows and wind moving through the branches. Still, the silence felt heavier now, as if the river itself was holding on to a secret it had not yet decided to release. Without warning, Evelyn changed the subject, asking Daniel about his past service, but he noticed she already seemed to know more than she was letting on. By the time they reached the edge of town, the connection between them had shifted from stranger and rescuer to something more uncertain, something shaped by unanswered questions. And deep beneath that uncertainty, the small metallic key continued its silent existence in evidence storage, waiting for someone to understand why it had been there at all, and why Evelyn Carter had been holding onto it so tightly when she fell into the river. By the time Daniel Mercer returned to his small rented room on the edge of town, the image of the river was still stuck in his mind like a recurring echo that refused to fade. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint flicker of a ceiling light, and the distant sound of passing cars should have grounded him in normalcy, but instead they only made the memory sharper. He placed his wet jacket on a chair and sat down, but his attention kept drifting back to Evelyn Carter and the way she had looked when she stepped away from the riverbank, as if she had not fully escaped something she could not name. He reached for his phone and opened the local county directory, searching for any record of the restricted river zone the ranger had mentioned. The results were incomplete, fragmented, and strangely inconsistent, as if parts of the public record had been removed or never properly archived. That alone was enough to make him pause. Daniel had learned long ago that missing information often meant someone had wanted it missing. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn Carter sat alone in a modest hotel room she had quickly arranged under a different name, her wet clothes now replaced, but her posture still tense. On the small table beside her was a folded piece of paper she had been carrying before the fall, partially damaged but still readable enough to reveal a set of coded coordinates and a date that appeared to be decades old. She stared at it without touching it, as if physical contact might confirm something she was not ready to accept. Her breathing was controlled, but her hands betrayed a slight tremor whenever she looked at the paper. Earlier that day, when she had fallen into the river, she had not been alone in her thoughts. There had been a moment just before the water took hold of her when she believed she was being followed, not by a person, but by something tied to the place itself. She had told no one that part of the story. Back at his room, Daniel reviewed the details again and again, focusing on the key that had been placed in evidence storage. Something about its design, though simple, felt deliberately outdated, like it belonged to a structure no longer in use but never officially demolished. He made a decision. The next morning, he drove back toward the river, stopping at the edge of the restricted zone marked by faded warning signs and partially collapsed fencing. The land beyond it was uneven, overgrown, and untouched for years, yet there were faint signs of past human activity if one knew where to look. As he stepped closer, his trained instincts picked up subtle inconsistencies in the terrain, areas where the ground had been disturbed and later concealed. He knelt near one of these spots and noticed a faint outline of a structure hidden beneath layers of soil and debris, barely visible but undeniably intentional in its placement. It was not a natural formation. It had once been built, and carefully buried afterward. The realization settled in slowly, heavy and undeniable, that whatever Evelyn Carter had fallen near the day before was not random geography. It was a place that had been erased from attention but not from existence. And somewhere, in a locked evidence room back in town, a single small key waited quietly, as if it already belonged to what Daniel was now standing above without fully understanding what he had found. The morning light over the river was pale and uncertain, as if the sky itself had not decided how to react to what lay beneath the surface of that forgotten stretch of land. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the restricted zone once again, this time with more intent and less hesitation. The faint outline he had discovered the day before still lingered in his mind, and now, under clearer light, the irregularities in the ground were even harder to ignore. He marked the area mentally, pacing slowly along its perimeter, noticing how the vegetation changed in subtle but unnatural patterns, as if it had been disturbed long ago and left to grow over something deliberately hidden. He crouched again, brushing away layers of dirt with careful movements, revealing fragments of stone that did not match the surrounding terrain. These were not natural formations. They were shaped, placed, and once part of a larger structure. Daniel exhaled slowly, recognizing the familiar feeling of uncovering something that had been intentionally erased. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn Carter sat in the same hotel room, but her composure had shifted overnight. The coated paper lay unfolded on the table, now marked with additional notes she had written herself in the early hours of the morning. Her handwriting was precise but uneven, as if she had been fighting hesitation with every word. She traced one of the coordinates again, whispering softly that it should not still exist. Her voice was barely audible, but the weight behind it suggested history rather than speculation. She finally reached for her phone and hesitated before dialing a number she had not called in years. The call did not connect. It redirected to a dead line that should have been active. That was when she confirmed what she had feared since the river. Someone had not only hidden the past, but also actively maintained its silence. Back at the river site, Daniel continued his search, now following a faint alignment in the ground that suggested a buried perimeter. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. It was not random erosion or forgotten construction. It was deliberate concealment of something built with purpose and later removed from public awareness. He photographed the area and sent the images to a retired contact who specialized in historical land records. The response came faster than expected, but it was brief and unsettling. There was no official documentation for any structure in that zone for the past 80 years, yet older aerial maps hinted at a facility that had once existed but was later removed from all updated surveys. The contradiction confirmed what Daniel already suspected. That place had been deliberately erased from modern record. As he stood again and looked across the overgrown land, he noticed something else, a faint metallic reflection partially buried near a broken section of stone. Kneeling, he uncovered a fragment of old industrial hardware, corroded but unmistakably engineered. It matched nothing currently in use, suggesting it belonged to a system long decommissioned. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. The text contained only one line: "She was never supposed to fall there." Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds without moving. The river behind him remained quiet, but now it no longer felt empty. It felt watched. And somewhere in that silence, the buried structure beneath his feet seemed less like forgotten history and more like something waiting to be opened again. The message on Daniel Mercer's phone lingered longer than it should have, not because it was long, but because it carried a tone that felt intentionally unfinished. He stood at the edge of the buried site, the wind moving lightly through the overgrown grass, and reread the single sentence again and again, as if repetition might reveal something hidden between the words. She was never supposed to fall there. No signature. No context. Just certainty. Daniel slowly lowered the phone and looked back at the disturbed ground. The fragment of industrial hardware he had uncovered earlier lay on a flat stone beside him, partially cleaned but still worn by time. It was not just old. It was designed for something larger than a simple structure. He had seen enough military and engineering equipment in his past to recognize when something belonged to a system rather than a building. This felt like part of a network, something meant to connect rather than stand alone. Across town, Evelyn Carter was no longer sitting still. She had packed a small bag, the coated paper now sealed inside a metal folder she had retrieved from beneath the hotel bed. Her movements were controlled but urgent, as if staying in one place too long would invite consequences she could not see. She checked her phone again. The number she had tried earlier still showed no connection, but now there was a new message waiting. It contained only coordinates, similar to the ones on her paper, but adjusted slightly, as if someone was correcting her path rather than revealing it. Evelyn's breathing tightened. She had not shared her location with anyone. Not recently. Not safely. And yet, someone was responding to her movements with precision. She left the hotel quietly, choosing back routes instead of main roads, eventually arriving at a small public library on the outskirts of town. Inside, she requested access to archived county maps, claiming historical research. The librarian did not question her, and within minutes, Evelyn was reviewing digitized records from decades ago. What she found made her pause completely. There, faintly visible in older aerial scans, was the same structure Daniel had begun uncovering at the river site. But it was labeled under a classification that no longer existed in modern records. A facility designation that had been deliberately removed from updated maps sometime after its construction. Evelyn leaned closer, tracing the faded outline on the screen. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. She had seen references to this before, in documents she had been told did not matter. At the same time, Daniel received another message. This one included a single image attachment. He opened it. It was an aerial photograph of the river zone taken decades earlier. The structure beneath the ground was fully visible in the image, large and symmetrical, surrounded by access roads that no longer existed. Beneath the image was a short caption, "It was never abandoned." It was sealed. Daniel felt a slow tightening in his chest, not from surprise alone, but from the realization that someone was actively guiding attention toward this place, not away from it. He turned back toward the buried site, now seeing it differently. Not as forgotten land, but as a threshold. As if the surface he stood on was only the final layer of a decision made long before either he or Evelyn had ever arrived. And deep beneath the soil, the structure remained silent, not because it was inactive, but because whatever had been sealed within it had not yet been asked to wake. The deeper Daniel Mercer looked into the buried site, the more it felt like the ground itself was resisting recognition. He stood in silence for a long moment after receiving the aerial photograph, studying every detail until the image no longer felt like history but like a warning that had been waiting to be read. The structure beneath the soil was not random or experimental. It was designed with precision, symmetry, and purpose, the kind of layout that suggested controlled access points and restricted internal zones. Daniel had seen similar planning before in decommissioned facilities overseas, but this one carried no public record, no official acknowledgement, and no trace of proper closure. That absence was not accidental. It was deliberate. He carefully marked the perimeter using small stones and natural reference points, creating a mental map of where the hidden structure might extend beyond visible disturbances in the ground. Each step he took reinforced the same conclusion. This place had been sealed, not abandoned. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter stood inside the quiet corner of the library, her eyes fixed on the archived maps displayed on an aging terminal. The faint outline of the same buried structure appeared again, but now she noticed something new. There were layers beneath the visible design, faint annotations embedded in older scans that had been partially redacted over time. One of the labels referenced a containment classification, a term she recognized from fragments of documentation she had once been allowed to see briefly before being removed from access entirely. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from confirmation that what she had been told to forget was still active in some form of record. She took a slow breath and copied the coordinates from the adjusted message she had received earlier, comparing them against the archived grid. The alignment was not exact, but it was intentional enough to suggest guidance rather than coincidence. Someone was directing her toward a precise location, and Daniel was already standing above it without knowing why. At the river site, Daniel noticed something else as he continued scanning the ground. A faint linear depression stretched beyond the initial area he had uncovered, partially hidden by natural regrowth. It suggested a secondary access route, possibly an entrance or maintenance corridor long since buried. He followed it carefully, moving in a slow arc until he reached a point where the soil composition changed noticeably. The texture was different, more compact, as if reinforced at some point in the past. He knelt and pressed his hand against the surface. It was colder than expected, even under the midday sun. That detail made him pause. Structures beneath the surface often retained environmental anomalies when sealed spaces remained intact. Daniel stood again and looked across the river, realizing that the entire area might not be a single hidden structure but part of a larger system that extended beyond what any current map showed. His phone vibrated again. Another message appeared, but this time it contained no words, only a single symbol. It matched a faint marking he had just uncovered on a partially exposed stone fragment near the perimeter. The symbol was simple but precise, suggesting identification rather than decoration. At that same moment, Evelyn left the library, her decision made without verbal confirmation or external advice. She walked directly toward the coordinates she had reconstructed, her step steady but increasingly purposeful. She no longer treated the situation as coincidence. It was direction. And somewhere between Daniel's position at the buried river site and Evelyn's path through the town streets, the same unseen system appeared to be drawing them toward a shared point beneath the surface of forgotten land, where silence was not absence, but containment waiting for acknowledgement. The message on Daniel Mercer's phone arrived without warning, but this time it was not a symbol or a warning phrase. It was a set of coordinates, precise and undeniable, marking a point only a few hundred yards from where he currently stood at the edge of the buried structure. He lifted his head slowly, scanning the landscape again, but now everything felt different. The ground was no longer just terrain. It was a map that had been partially revealed, layer by layer, waiting for someone to interpret it correctly. He marked the new coordinates in his mind and began walking carefully along the faint linear depression he had discovered earlier. Each step brought a subtle change in the soil, reinforcing the idea that what lay beneath was not uniform but structured in sections, possibly compartmentalized. The silence around him was no longer peaceful. It felt measured, as if the environment itself was conserving information. Across town, Evelyn Carter moved with equal determination. The route she followed was not direct, but it aligned with the adjusted coordinates she had reconstructed from the library archives. She passed through quieter streets, avoiding main intersections, her attention fixed on the sense that every step was reducing the distance between herself and something long buried. She no longer questioned whether she was being guided. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. At one point, she stopped at the edge of a small overlook that faced the river valley in the distance. From there, she could not see Daniel, but she felt the same direction pulling both of them toward a single convergence point beneath the land. Her grip tightened on the metal folder containing the coded document, now partially rewritten with her own annotations. She had begun to recognize that the document was not just a record. It was an instruction set. Back at the buried site, Daniel reached a point where the ground sloped downward slightly, forming what appeared to be a concealed entry zone covered by decades of sediment and vegetation. The alignment of stone fragments and soil density changes suggested a structured boundary. He crouched again, brushing away debris with controlled movements, revealing a faint seam running horizontally beneath the surface. It was not natural erosion. It was a constructed division, possibly a sealed access point. He paused, taking in the realization that this was not simply a buried building but something engineered to remain undisturbed. As he studied the seam, his phone vibrated again. Another message appeared, but this time it included both the same symbol from earlier and a short directive: "Do not open alone." Daniel exhaled slowly. The warning confirmed what he already suspected. Whatever lay beneath was not meant to be discovered casually. It required coordination, or perhaps authorization that no longer officially existed. Meanwhile, Evelyn reached a fenced boundary near the outskirts of town where the terrain began to shift from residential to undeveloped land. The coordinates she followed were now nearly identical to the ones Daniel had marked at the river site. She stopped at the edge of the fence and looked toward the distant tree line, knowing that beyond it lay the same hidden structure Daniel was currently standing above. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Daniel stood at the edge of the buried seam, while Evelyn stood at the threshold of entry from the opposite direction. And between them, beneath layers of soil, silence, and forgotten record, the sealed structure remained unchanged, as if waiting for the moment when both paths would finally meet at the same point of decision. Daniel Mercer remained still for several seconds after reading the final message. The words, "Do not open alone," did not feel like a warning in the traditional sense. They felt like a rule that had been enforced before, by someone who understood exactly what lay beneath the ground. He slowly lowered his phone and looked again at the seam he had uncovered. The structure beneath the surface was no longer an abstract idea. It was now something physically present, something waiting just below his hands. Every instinct he had developed over years of field operations told him the same thing. This was not a site to be approached casually, and certainly not alone. Yet there was no visible authority left to enforce that instruction, only the instruction itself. At the same time, Evelyn Carter stood at the edge of the wooded boundary outside town, her gaze fixed toward the distant river line. The coordinates had brought her to a point where the terrain subtly changed, where the land sloped downward in a way that mirrored what Daniel had found on the opposite side. She checked her notes again, confirming alignment. The system was no longer abstract. It was spatial. It was physical. And it was converging. She took a slow step forward, then stopped, as if sensing that crossing the boundary would mean committing to something that could not be reversed. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. This time it contained only a single instruction: wait for confirmation. No sender. No signature. Only timing. Back at the river site, Daniel made the decision not to proceed further into the seam alone. Instead, he began widening his search radius, carefully documenting the ground formations and marking reference points for a potential controlled entry. As he moved, he noticed that the buried structure did not appear uniform. There were sections of varying density, suggesting compartmentalization beneath the surface. Some areas felt reinforced, while others appeared intentionally weakened, as if designed for selective access rather than full exposure. He paused near one of these transition zones and pressed his hand against the soil. The temperature shift was subtle but noticeable again, reinforcing the idea that the space beneath was not entirely sealed off from environmental interaction. Meanwhile, Evelyn began walking along the boundary line, following the edge of the wooded slope without crossing fully into the restricted zone. Her pace was slow but deliberate, matching the rhythm of her thoughts as she reconciled the archival data with the physical geography in front of her. The deeper she moved along the perimeter, the more the landscape seemed to confirm what the records had implied. This was not a natural formation. It was a constructed concealment layered over something older, something designed with intention rather than abandonment. She stopped again when she noticed faint markers embedded in the ground, partially obscured but arranged in a pattern that suggested guidance rather than decoration. She knelt briefly, brushing away soil until the arrangement became clearer. It mirrored a directional alignment pointing toward the river site. At that exact moment, Daniel received another message. This one contained no words, only a live coordinate update. The point was now moving slightly, adjusting in real time, as if responding to Evelyn's position. He looked up sharply, realizing that whatever system was coordinating this was not static. It was responsive. It was tracking convergence. Evelyn stood slowly, sensing the same shift through instinct rather than information. The air felt different now, heavier with implication rather than uncertainty. She turned her head toward the direction indicated by the alignment markers and understood that her path and Daniel's were no longer separate investigations. They were two halves of a single approach vector. Beneath them, unseen and silent, the buried structure remained intact, but no longer passive. It was aware of proximity, and for the first time in decades, it was being approached from two synchronized points at once. Sometimes the quietest moments decide everything that comes after. The morning after the discovery along the river felt different, as if the air itself had changed its weight. The veteran stood outside the modest shelter they had returned to, his hands resting on the wooden railing, watching the early light spread across the open land. The German shepherd sat beside him, calm but alert, its eyes fixed on the horizon as if it could still sense echoes of what had happened the day before. The woman remained inside, recovering from the shock of the river incident and the emotional weight of what she had revealed. What began as a simple act of rescue had slowly transformed into something neither of them fully understood yet. The veteran was not a man who believed in coincidence. Years of service had taught him to observe patterns, to trust instincts, and to notice when events carried meaning beyond their surface. Still, nothing in his experience had prepared him for a situation like this, where a stranger pulled from cold water would turn out to be connected to something so large and carefully hidden from the world. Inside the shelter, the woman finally stepped out, wrapping a simple coat around her shoulders. Her expression carried both exhaustion and clarity, as if she had crossed an invisible line in her life and could not return to what came before. She looked toward the veteran and the dog, pausing for a moment before speaking softly about the papers and details she had begun to remember more clearly. There was mention of property records, old accounts, and a place that had been forgotten by most people for decades. The veteran listened without interruption, his focus steady. He did not react with surprise or disbelief. Instead, he treated every word as a piece of a larger picture that was slowly coming into view. The German shepherd stood and moved closer to the woman, sniffing gently at her hand before settling nearby, as if accepting her presence as part of its circle of trust. That small gesture seemed to ease the tension in her shoulders. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, carrying with it a sense of distance and possibility. The veteran suggested they walk the property line while she explained what she knew. It was not a formal decision, just a natural step forward, as though the situation itself required movement rather than hesitation. As they walked, the woman described fragments of memory. Tied to documents she had once seen, references to land that had been left unattended, and instructions that had never been fully explained to her. The veteran asked simple questions, not pressing, but guiding the conversation in a way that helped her organize scattered thoughts. The dog stayed close, occasionally moving ahead and then returning, as if mapping invisible boundaries only it could sense. There was no rush in their pace, only a steady progression through open land that seemed ordinary on the surface but increasingly significant in meaning. By midday, they reached a section of the property where old markers stood half buried in soil and time. The woman paused, recognizing something she could not fully explain at first. The veteran noticed the change in her breathing, the subtle shift in her attention. He did not speak immediately. Some moments required silence before understanding could form. What lay ahead was not yet fully revealed, but it was clear that the path they were on had been waiting long before any of them arrived, and would continue long after this single day ended. The truth does not arrive all at once. It reveals itself in layers, only when a person is ready to see it. The afternoon sun had shifted lower, stretching long shadows across the dry ground as the veteran, the woman, and the German shepherd continued walking the uneven edge of the property. The air was still, broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of wind moving through scattered brush. The woman kept glancing ahead, as if expecting the land itself to confirm what her memory could not yet fully explain. The veteran remained slightly behind her, observing both her reactions and the environment with the same disciplined attention he once used in unfamiliar territory during his service. Nothing here felt random anymore. Every marker, every broken post, every faded boundary line seemed to point toward something deliberately placed and carefully forgotten. The dog suddenly slowed near a patch of disturbed soil, lowering its head and circling once before stopping. The veteran noticed immediately and moved closer, kneeling beside the spot. Without disturbing it. The woman hesitated, then stepped forward as recognition began to surface in her expression. She explained that this part of the land matched descriptions she had once heard in passing conversations, references to sections that were never formally documented in public records. The words carried uncertainty, but her tone was becoming more grounded, as if the act of remembering was slowly strengthening her confidence. The veteran did not interrupt. He simply observed, letting her thoughts connect naturally. The dog remained still, watching the same point in the ground, calm but intensely focused. There was a sense that something had been marked here long ago, not with visibility, but with intention. As they continued forward, the terrain subtly changed. What had seemed like ordinary open land began to show faint signs of structure beneath time and neglect. The woman pointed out an alignment in the distance, barely visible, suggesting that what they were walking on might have once been part of a larger organized space rather than empty land. The veteran considered this carefully, mentally mapping distances and angles, recognizing patterns that suggested planning rather than randomness. They stopped again near a weathered post partially hidden by dry grass. The woman's voice lowered as she recalled a name tied to old documents, though she struggled to fully retrieve it. The veteran asked her to focus only on what she was certain of, not what she feared might be missing. That simple instruction helped her steady her thoughts. She described a structure that had once existed nearby, something that had been removed or concealed over time, though she could not yet determine why. The dog moved around the post, then returned to stand between them, as if confirming the importance of the location. The veteran looked across the horizon, noting how the land extended in a way that suggested hidden continuity rather than separation. It was becoming clear that this was not just a forgotten property, but part of a larger story that had been intentionally left incomplete. As the light continued to fade, they stood together in silence, each processing the same realization in their own way. What they had uncovered so far was only the edge of something far larger, and whatever lay ahead would require patience, clarity, and a willingness to follow every remaining fragment to its source. Some discoveries do not change the world all at once. They change the people who are standing closest to them first. The final light of the afternoon had begun to fade, leaving the land wrapped in a soft golden haze as the veteran, the woman, and the German shepherd stood at the edge of what now felt less like an empty field and more like a forgotten boundary of something intentional. The silence between them was no longer uncertain. It was focused, heavy with meaning, as if the land itself had finally agreed to reveal what it had been holding back for so long. The woman slowly stepped forward again, her eyes scanning the uneven ground near the weathered post they had found earlier. Her breathing was steadier now, as if the act of returning to this place had unlocked a deeper layer of memory. She pointed slightly to the side, describing a detail she had not been able to articulate before, something about measurements recorded in an old document that referenced distance rather than visible landmarks. The veteran immediately understood the significance of that distinction. He looked down and began pacing slowly, calculating steps, angles, and alignment with quiet precision. The German shepherd moved with him, mirroring his direction, pausing when he paused, as if both were reading the same invisible map. After several moments, the veteran stopped. He turned slightly and studied the ground more closely, noticing a subtle irregularity in the soil pattern, too precise to be natural erosion alone. He knelt and brushed away a thin layer of dry earth, revealing the faint outline of something beneath. It was not dramatic, not sudden, but deliberate in its placement, like a mark left for someone patient enough to notice. The woman stepped closer, her expression tightening as recognition finally aligned with memory. She explained that this area had once been referenced as a restricted section in older documentation, not publicly explained, only mentioned in passing instructions tied to inheritance records she had never fully understood at the time. The veteran did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply observed the consistency between her memory and what was physically present. The dog suddenly shifted its attention to a point a few feet away, circling once before stopping and looking back at them. That movement guided the veteran's attention further along the ground, where a faint seam became visible between compacted soil and what appeared to be a concealed edge. Carefully, he cleared more of the surface, revealing what looked like a reinforced panel or access point that had been covered over with time and neglect rather than hidden with haste. There was no urgency in the moment, only confirmation that something had been waiting here for a very long time. The woman stepped back slightly, placing a hand over her mouth as she processed what she was seeing. Her earlier confusion was now giving way to clarity, as fragmented memories began to connect into a single continuous thread. The veteran stood again, studying the structure without touching it further, recognizing that this was not something to rush. Whatever lay beneath had been preserved with intention, not accident. The German shepherd sat quietly beside him, calm but attentive, as if acknowledging that the search had reached a point of completion rather than conclusion. As the last light of the day faded across the open land, the three of them remained there in silence, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what they had found no longer belonged to speculation.